Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator for the Ramsey County Library, and I am so pleased to see everyone who made it today through the snow. You are true Minnesotans, and our speaker today, Duchess Harris, is an even truer Minnesotan, although I don't know if she was born here, but she arrived at 10:30. Just to make sure that she was here for the audience. And if that isn't the Minnesota spirit in action, I don't know what is. So we're very pleased to have Professor Duchess Harris from Macalester back again for 3 more talks. Her talk today is on class in America. I'm fascinated to hear it. And this talk was made possible through the good offices of a couple of sponsors that I would like to thank. First of all, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, our program partner for these Tuesday programs. For those of you who are not members of OLLI, the library is one venue, but they have about 35 others, lots of good programs. We do have an OLLI assistant here today. Do you want to raise your hand? There she is. So if anybody's interested in more information about joining that fine organization and getting reserved seats for these Tuesday Scholar talks, please talk to Betty. Also, I would like to thank Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, who make these talks possible financially. The fund comes to us through the auspices of the Legacy Amendment passed by the voters of Minnesota. So ultimately, I would like to thank all of you. And now let us turn the podium over to our fine speaker today. I'd like you to welcome Duchess Harris. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. You have no idea how delighted I am. I see at least 70 people here, and it's about 65 more than I was expecting when I saw the driving conditions. And so I'm just going to take it personally and think that it's about me. So thank you. Awesome. Okay, so I wanted to open up today with why I wanted to teach these books. And so I have them on display here. As Judy said, it's a series of 8 books in a collection that I've done about class in America. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write these books is because this is such a difficult topic to talk about. And so I recognize some faces in the crowd. I know some of you know that I'm on the faculty of Macalester College. You might not know, however, that I'm on sabbatical, but when I return in the fall, it will be my 25th year. So that's a quite amount. So I've kind of seen like a second generation. And if I wait about 6 more years, I will have the children of my first students. So that is humbling. But when I teach my classes, I already teach very challenging things. I usually teach about racism and sexism, but what I find that is even more difficult to take on is discussions about socioeconomic status. And so one of the things I want to ask you all to think about today is, why is it so difficult to have a class where you talk about class? Right? It's a really tough thing. And I think one of the reasons is that most 18-year-olds rarely understand their class background. So a little bit about me: I have 3 kids. They are 20, they are 15, and 12. I don't think they really kind of get how we are in the world, even though my husband and I constantly try to emphasize to them that they are not struggling. They probably disagree with that. And they're disagreeing while they're looking on their iPhones, right? Our fault, but seriously. So when I'm teaching my classes, one of the things I like to do is give an assignment that I call an intellectual autobiography. And that is when I have students write what their life story is. It's a way that I can get to know them. What is fascinating is how they respond about their class position. Does anybody want to guess what almost every single student says? Everybody's middle class. It's amazing to me how everybody is middle class. Now, the thing about it is that in elite spaces of higher education, which is what Macalester, of course, would be, hardly anyone is middle class. Now that's the honest to goodness truth, and I'm going to give you the data on that. And so looking in the crowd and knowing that we have OLLI participants, you might have grandkids that are going to college. If they are either a little bit too young for that or beyond that, you might not realize how much private college is right now. So I will tell you that room, tuition, and board at McAllister is $66,500 a year. $66,500 a year for one kid. Now, 20% of our student body isn't on any financial aid whatsoever. None. No financial aid. 20% of the students have someone in their family that writes a check for $250,000 for a bachelor's degree. And then they write me an essay and say that they're middle class. Now, right? And but why do they think that? Because everyone that they live near, because this is the way neighborhoods are set up, is just like them, right? And so, and if you go to certain schools, whatever you see, that's just normal to you. And what we've done in America is tell everyone that what is normal is middle class. Now, I can't give you the data of who all the students are at McAllister because we're a private school. But I said to myself, I think I'll look up a public school, because it's easy to get that information. So the public school I chose was the University of Michigan, because even though it's public, it's also elite. And so I thought this is the best apples to apples. So a few years ago, the entering class at the University of Michigan, what used to we would call freshmen, now we call them first-year students. Just want to be clear about that. There were 6,000 first-year students at the University of Michigan, the entering class. All right, 254 of them came from families that had incomes of 50 grand or less. 254 out of 6,000. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, who are these, 5,800 people? So the median income for a family to send your kids to the University of Michigan is $154,000 a year. Now, not only that, 9.3% of the students in this class came from families where the income was $630,000 a year or more. That would be my book, The 1%. That's who the 1% is. But almost 10% of the entering class is the 1% at the University of Michigan. Now, more than 66% of the students come from families that have an income of at least $110,000, which is really the upper middle class. Right? So the truth of the matter is, out of those entering 6,000 students, you probably don't have 1,000 that are middle class. Even though I've never taught at Michigan, I actually did some research there for a semester. I bet if I gave them the assignment, they'd all say they were middle class. Aviva.
Do you have any data about whether this is different than it was, say, 20 years ago?
Well, I think it would have to be, right? I think it would have to be. So my alma mater for graduate school is the University of Minnesota, and if you didn't hear the question is, how has the data shifted? I'm sure many of you all went to the University of Minnesota. You can say, well, when I went, tuition was like $1,000 a year, right? Okay, does that sound familiar to anyone, right? What if it was less than thank you, okay, less than $1,000 a year. I can't pull it up on my laptop because my slides are on my laptop, but I would think in-state tuition at the University of Minnesota would have to be at least 20. It would have to be at least 20. What if you were out of state? Okay, how does that translate in terms of our growth in income? I don't know what your growth in income has been. I keep trying to tell our kids, we haven't had a lot of growth, right? Stop asking for stuff. And so I think the way that it actually translates percentage-wise, it's probably something along the lines of a 300% increase, I think, in higher education in terms of the ability for someone who is truly middle class to be able to send their kids to college. Before I get to your question, I just want to say how I'm defining truly middle class, right? Because that's contested. First of all, for the purpose of this talk, I would just say, I'm going to say the Midwest, right? Because it's a very different thing, right? Income in San Francisco is different than income in Alabama, right? In the Midwest, and I'm using Robert Reich, okay, that would be $75,000 for a family of four. that is what middle class would be. Now, the thing about it is, if your family income is $75,000 a year, even with financial aid, 66.5 is a reach, isn't it? So my students keep writing that essay for me. And then Parents Weekend, I keep meeting their families, and it doesn't add up. In fact, one class in particular, I had one young woman write her essay, and then had the other young woman write her essay, and I observed them a lot, and then I waited for Parents Weekend, and one young woman, the dad was a part-time truck driver. The other young woman, the mom had just won the $650,000 MacArthur Genius Grant Award. Brilliant environmental lawyer. But I was like, wow, do you realize both your daughters think they're middle class? Neither. Here and then over here, yeah. I don't mind taking some as we go.
I'm worried about the filming. Can I just bring the mic?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, if you have a question, wait for the mic so the television audience can hear as well.
In your study at McAllister, did those students who were there on a full scholarship, full ride, were from poorer backgrounds?
Yeah.
Do they also think they were middle class?
They feel it. But I mean, financial aid can be, that's a graduated scale. So you can be on financial aid and maybe get, $15,000. Well, your parents are still writing a check for $50,000. That's very different than if you're there on a free ride. And we have students like that, right? But you're gonna feel very different if you know you're on a free ride, and then you also know that some other student maybe has work study, maybe they work in the library, but their parents are still paying the majority of it. So there are different ways, there are different ways of being middle class, because one of the things I will also talk about today is cultural capital. Because one thing about being middle class in America is what you know and who you know, not just what you make, right? Okay, right here. Yeah. It's okay, we're gonna go with the flow, Judy. I know it's making you nervous, and I can also repeat the questions if we don't get the mic.
Thank you. My question was about how you were defining middle class, and you came up with that. That's $75,000 a year. Do you know if that's a median income? Who is Robert Reich?
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, he's in my world famous, which that means no one knows, right? so bear with me. An economist at Berkeley, and we're basically talking about a family of four, right? And so yeah, median. He's just saying this is like in a place like here or Wisconsin or Iowa, this is gonna play out so differently. I mean, if you're talking New York City, it's nowhere near that number. Right, but I mean also, as I said, if you're talking about Mississippi, it's not that much. Okay, and part of it, I wanted to use that just so you have in your mind, what I'm referring to, and also what your point of reference might be, and also how expenses have changed, right? Because McAllister used to not be 66.5, right? You could be an alum and not realize that it's that much right now. So out of these 8 books that I've written, as Judy mentioned, they're all different topics. I could talk about each of them for an hour. The one, however, that I picked to talk about today is class and education, partly because it's a passion of mine. It's where I spend most of my time. However, as we are having our discussion, and depending on Judy's comfort level, because I don't want to stress Judy out, I'm okay if you all want to ask a question. If we don't get the mic to you, I will repeat the question back in the mic. So here they are, just once again. I wanted to write about really what it means to be poor in America, which is why we have that volume, because poverty is really something that has stigma in our nation, right? People are ashamed of being impoverished, and also we have different ideas of what that means. And then, the inverse of that, of course, is the 1%. And the truth of the matter is, when you think about what popular culture looks like, we actually see the 1%. We might not know them, right? But we see them more than we see poverty, right? And so I see some looks on people's faces. What do I mean by this? If we were to talk about television, which was what we watched, right, in the 70s, which people don't really do that anymore, right? Because my people are like, I'll look in my phone or my device, and it's not like a TV. When we had network television, if you saw the interior of a home, let's just say All in the Family, right, Archie Bunker, it's his armchair, then she has a chair, and then there's an end table with a lamp on it, and that's the sense of what an interior of a home might look like. And you think, okay, so this is how everyday people live. People now watch the Kardashians, right? But if you watch the Kardashians, you are being inundated with the 1%, and depending on how old you are, right? Like my 7th grader, you see that, and it's like, wow, why don't we have those things? Because we're not the Kardashians, right? But we don't have a lot of images in popular culture of people who are poor. We really don't. We also don't talk about class mobility very much and what it means to be born in a particular station and then to move into a different station, and the fact that, honestly, most people don't change stations. A lot of people do. I did. My husband did, right? Together, we really did, given how we grew up. But a lot of people, you are born a particular way, you stay that way. How work impacts all of that, and then, of course, all of the things that are going on in healthcare now and how much that has changed. So that's what these books do. They are actually written on, which would be considered Common Core standards, like an 8th grade reading level, and we do that so that they can be taught in schools. They're in a series of books for 6th to 12th graders, but adults just enjoy them because if you want some like quick information, right, like how are you defining middle class, you can just get it right there in the book. So to start off just talking about class and education, like any other public policy issue, education is constantly in motion, right? And it has changed profoundly since most of us were near any kind of schooling. And so, as many of us know, the mayor of New York City right now is Bill de Blasio. And, you know, New York City is always a place where there's contested things going on with public education, particularly since, you know, they have schools that you can test into. And because if you're looking at different class backgrounds, you're going to find absolutely everything in New York. And so he started a pre-K for all program, which, you know, is a big deal because actually when I went to kindergarten wasn't even all day, right? You either went to morning, you went to afternoon. It was like a big deal if you were going to nap there or not, right? It wasn't like a full day program, and pre-K actually didn't even exist. Now he has pushed this program where everyone can get it, but just like any public policy issue, there's controversy, and one of the controversies is how the tax money is being used for it, and then also what kinds of schools it's being used for. And so as I was looking into this, one of the things that I found was that you can have your child in private school and then use some of your tax money to go towards that. And so it's really not evening the playing field in terms of providing equity with the public schools, which is one of the critiques of it. The people who are in favor of it say, at least we have something at all. And so that's just what is like recent in terms of like movement, some of the things that we're trying to do right now in this country. So I'll also just talk a little bit about what it means if you get early education or not, because as you know, everyone doesn't get early education. And so it has a tremendous impact on the young person's life. And a big part of that has to do with how educated the parents are. So all the studies show the more educated the parents, the more words they use around the students. This also matters too, I don't have this on the slide, but if English is your first language, right? So if you have more than one language going on in the home and people aren't using as many words, people might not be around as much, if people are having multiple jobs, then, you know, students, that's one way in which people end up starting off at a disadvantage. Okay, so just a little bit of history of class and education. We've always had a class divide in education, even though we've always had public education. And some people really don't think about it that way all the time. They say, you know, this is America, everyone has a right to go to school. Some people don't think about the fact that all schools aren't created equally. So if you go back as far as Thomas Jefferson, he believed in a good public education. He also believed in paying tuition for private schools. And so when you have both of those things going on at the same time, you end up, setting the ground for lots of inequity. Also, Jefferson is complicated because he believed in slavery. And I know many of you in this room have heard some of my other talks, so you know that one of the things I talk about is that he also was biologically related to slavery. And so, Jefferson had children with a woman who was enslaved, right? So he's very complex, he's very paradoxical, lots of conflicts. And then also there was lots of support for intelligence tests in the early 1900s, which were kind of set up so that you could decide who was smart and who wasn't, and all of these things clearly had biases in them. So I just share all of this to say that we don't really start on even ground with education. It starts with inequity, and anytime you start in a position like that, you're going to have an exponential growth. Okay. So after the Civil War, some court cases I always bring up because that's just my teaching style is that Plessy versus Ferguson, as we know, 1896 is going to say that separate is equal. It is going to take almost 60 years for that to be turned over by Brown. One of the things now that's being taught commonly on college campuses is that Brown did not happen with all deliberate speed, which was the charge from the Supreme Court. In fact, there had to be a Brown 2, which was a second ruling in 1955 that some people don't know about. And Brown was a slow journey to the point that you get up until the 1970s where there are places that still aren't desegregated. And also you have ways of getting around the Supreme Court ruling, such as you could set up private schools for dollar tuition, or say that schools were religious schools and then outside of the purview of being public schools, but they could be religious schools without tuition. And so a lot of this was to maintain the inequity. And then just to talk about gender somewhat, Title IX is the first program that comes along to make sure that there is equal funding for women and men, particularly in the area of sports. Which now I'm going to give a talk next week on race, gender, and sports and talk about how things have changed so much for women in sports. So all of that just gives you an idea of some of the challenges. The other thing about talking about class in America and talking about class and education is a lot of times people don't understand the distinction between income and wealth. Right? And so you'll have people who have pretty good income and you think they have to be doing well. They make what my relatives would say, good money, right? Whatever that is. It's like being middle class. What is good money? But wealth in America is a lot less for people of color than a lot of people can imagine. And so on average, white families in America have $100,000 worth of wealth. How would that happen? That would be, equity in a home. That might be inheritance. That might be retirement. These are things that if you have a certain level of education, you might have an expectation that you would have these things. And of course, that's going to vary. But that is just like dead in the center that white families would have $100,000 worth of wealth. Black and Latinx families have less than $10,000 worth of wealth. And that's partly because wealth is multi-generational. So in lots of families, once the elders pass away, there might be something to pass on. I know in other communities, what you might end up inheriting is not only a lack of insurance, you might also have to pay for the funeral. Right? So it's not even that, it's just, you're like at zero and there's nothing to inherit. You might, on top of that, get a bill. And so that's a very different thing. And that, of course, is because this is all intergenerational, right? Wealth only comes at a point when one generation creates it and then passes it on to the next. And so also, something that's changed in education is increasing access for women, which is, helping with the wealth gap, and then also having access for students with disabilities, which has changed drastically since I've started teaching. I know my oldest brother is 61, and he had mild dyslexia, and at the time, that was a very big deal. Now, not only would that not be considered anything, students at Macalester have a range of disabilities, and we have all kinds of accommodations for them. Okay, so lacking education ends up impacting your income because of the employment gap. And so what this slide is indicating is the difference between black men and white men in terms of education and income. And so what the graph essentially tells you is that if you have a high school diploma, you still make maybe 60% of what a white guy would if you were a black guy. It isn't until you get a professional degree, a degree past college, that you could end up on income parity. And you have to think to yourself, what percentage would that be for someone to get a graduate degree? And not just people of color, any racial background. So can anyone tell me about what percentage of Americans, and this will be mostly white Americans, have a 4-year degree? Like what percentage of Americans have a 4-year degree? I heard 40. Yeah, it's less than 30. It's in the high 20s. Okay. Yeah, and I see you all like, oh, whoa, like we're in Ollie, right? It's like, okay. So if you're saying that, white Americans, maybe only 28% have a four-year degree, translate that into communities that, started several hundred years later. And so, sure, if you're a black guy and you end up finishing law school, you're going to be okay. What does that mean if you just have some college? It's very different. Okay. So let's talk about the difference between public schools, and then we'll talk some about private schools. So public schools, as we know, get their funding mostly from the local government, a little bit from the federal government, but how public schools operate, people in this room would know this because, you're of a certain generation, it's really your property taxes, right? So I'll ask undergrads, I'll say, did you happen to go to a public school? They'll say, yeah, I went to public school. Do you feel like you got a good education? They're like, well, I got into Macalester. I'm like, yeah, that's okay. You did all right. And then I'll say to them, well, you've tutored at some schools that maybe didn't have the resources that the school that you went to had. And they were like, yeah, I really noticed that. Why do you think that is? I don't know. Right? Like they don't understand the correlation between, number one, their families owned a home, right? And there would be some classmates of theirs that didn't grow up in that kind of situation, and then own their home in a neighborhood where the property tax was high enough that the education was good enough that they could be where they were. And all of that, of course, impacts what our education is. I happened to be at a meeting just last night. It was a community listening meeting with State Representative Rena Moran, who represents 65B in St. Paul, and then Attorney General Keith Ellison was there. And I was just curious, they were gonna talk about different things, but they were gonna talk about education, so I'm trying to keep up. And I found out that the St. Paul NAACP is suing the city of St. Paul. Did you all realize that? I was just like, how do I not know this? Because not only that, of course, I know all the players involved. I know the plaintiffs and the defendants. So I said, this is interesting. But it's 2019, and they're suing St. Paul Public Schools for being segregated. We can talk about that during question and answer. I'm not going to say I know everything because I just found out last night. But I think that says a lot about what is going on in St. Paul education, because my kids don't go to St. Paul public schools, but I can assure you where they go to school, there's no big lawsuit. No big lawsuit, right? Like they're closing early today because of the weather, but no one's in litigation, no one feels oppressed. There's a reason for that. So class and culture. This is where I like to talk about cultural capital. And when I'm talking about cultural capital, this refers back to what I said earlier. It's not just who you know, but what you know and what you understand, right? So on a college campus, one thing that can disrupt students first off is the food, right? They'll say, I don't recognize the food. That's all about class, right? You might not enjoy a certain kind of food, but if you grew up in a certain kind of family, you at least have seen it before. Okay, and so what this whole thing is about culture is, you know, what we consider to be highbrow culture, which has everything to do with, you know, what you wear, where you can go, what you do. It's hilarious because 18 to 20-year-olds like all wear jeans, but I'm starting to be able to pick out the nuances of it, right? And there's something about the more ripped they are, the more expensive they are. And, you know, as a parent, I'm completely offended by that because if I'm going to spend $150 for a pair of pants, I want all the cloth. All the cloth. In fact, I want 2 pairs of pants, right? But all I see are like thighs and an empty wallet that I have, right? But, you know, if my 15-year-old daughter's wearing them, she's like a cool kid. No, what that really means is like she's marking herself as upper middle class. That's what that means. Okay, so my kids watch these tapes, they hate these. They're like, you're talking about us again. And I'm like, I gave birth to you. Okay, so private schools. Only 10% of students in America go to private schools. And one of the things about private schools is that you can get around some of the state education laws, and the students usually do well just because they're coming from families that have been able to provide them the opportunities that get them in those situations, such as pre-K is a no-brainer, right? It's like, of course my child would go to pre-K. And then all the extra stuff, right? Like if you need a little tutoring, if you need a little this. So they've had all that. So one of the things is that, you know, Wellstone used to say, you know, we all do better if we're all doing better, right? They're doing better because they just started off better. So that's partly what's going on. Okay. Now, this study here is something that absolutely blew me away because I grew up in the Northeast and because I know it to be true, that 1 in 20 Harvard students come from the same 7 schools. Okay, I want you to take that in for a minute. And the reason why this resonates with me so much is that I grew up in New England, right? I was raised in Connecticut. So immediately when I found out that 5 were elite private schools and 2 were public schools, I said to myself, oh, I know what those private schools are, right? And partly that's because, full disclosure, I went on academic scholarship to an elite boarding school, right? My parents couldn't afford it, but it just so happened I was a smart kid. I know that's shocking, right? And so I passed all the little tests, and they were like, oh, a little smart black girl. Okay, you get the little smart black girl scholarship. There was only one. I got it. And so I saw that, and I said to myself, well, one of those schools has to be Exeter. So I was like, let me just get online and see how much it costs to go to Exeter for 1 year in the 9th grade. Right now I have a 9th grader. So like 1 child, 1 9th grade. How much do you think it costs to go to Exeter? 47. And that's without the ripped jeans, because you can't go to Exeter and like not have the cool clothes, right? So I was like, oh, well, I mean, I guess like if you come from a family that can spend $200,000 for high school, that's probably going to increase your chances of getting into Harvard. Not to mention, a lot of elite schools give benefits to the children of alumni. So I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Pennsylvania. This is fascinating. They interview the kids of the parents who went to Penn in a different building. Like, that's the level. You know, I'll be honest, it's because like we feel bad that we're not Harvard. So we're just kind of like, we'll really treat our alumni kids well, because what will happen if they want to go to Harvard? So, but I mean, that says everything about status and class and education. It's the same thing with homeschooling. How are you going to homeschool your kid if your first language isn't English? How are you going to homeschool your kid if you need 2 jobs? Got to be home to school them, right? So homeschooling is predominantly educated white women, who are usually married to educated white men who make enough money. I mean, in this day and age, to make enough money that one parent doesn't have to work, it's pretty good income. So that's some of the things that's going on with schooling now. And so in the last, I don't know, 40 years, there's been like this tug of war about what to do with public schools. Are we gonna have charter schools? Are we gonna have magnet schools? What do we do about the voucher systems, right? They're all different from each other. These are like very basic explanations of what they were. If I were teaching a grad seminar, I'd have to prep more than this. Essentially, the voucher system is the family's given the money, and then you're able to take that money and educate your child in a way in which you see fit, okay? Magnet schools are public, and they have special programs. They have to be in compliance with the laws of the state around education, which is different than going to a private school. Then charter schools, that's a mix. That's a mix. And one of my kids went to a charter school for 2 years. It was really interesting to see how it played out because it's a mix of getting funding from the city, right? So public funding, but then private funding, which depending on what the charter school is, that could come from anywhere. So then you start getting some ideological stuff going on with the school. They don't have tuition, but then they have a board of directors, which I also got to see in the school that my daughter was going to, also really plays out with some class-based stuff because the parents who had less money felt like they were never asked to be on the board. So these things, and and if you're new to like educating young people, knowing the differences, but like this is, this is like the Hooked on Phonics version, right? This is super simple. This is not enough information if it's your kid. And so, how do people navigate all of this? It's incredibly challenging. Charter schools, all of these things, I'll just say, are controversial because people, of course, are very passionate and very political about what happens to, their relatives. And so their arguments for and against, they're all related to class and essentially what you're going to do with low-income kids. And I'll be honest with you, the fear, if you're not low income, of having your kid with those kids, right? Like that's just real, right? What are we gonna do if our kid is next to that kid? And then also the very real fear, if you are low income, what are they doing to my kid? And so this is the kind of stress, if you have 47K, you're not even thinking about any of that, right? You're just like, oh, look, like, my kid can, take, and I mean, the electives now that you can take in private school, it's like amazing. My daughter's at Matamidi Public School, 9th grade. She can take like physics. They didn't have physics in high school. I went to a fancy school, they didn't have physics. They were like, that's for 12th grade maybe, if there are enough kids. And so, but I mean, the options now that you can take economics, all of these things. The fights that are going on in charter schools also impact the curriculum, right? So it's like you have all these discussions going on and all these tensions between, the income brackets. It then impacts who can teach what the teachers are paid, what's being offered. Magnet schools then, on the other hand, were to, increase some benefits for low-income kids. What ended up being the problem with that is that in this school in Hartford, Connecticut, and I grew up in the town next to Hartford, in 2018, this family sued saying that the son couldn't go to the magnet school because they'd already reached the black quota. Right? Which, I mean, this kind of thing, all of this wasn't going on, in the 60s. But in 71, you get the Supreme Court case, Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which allows low-income majority black areas to convert their schools into magnet schools, but then they need diversity across different places. It also, doesn't take into account what if there are other groups of color. Like look at St. Paul now that has a Hmong population. Look at West St. Paul that has a strong Latinx population. So these things end up being much more complicated than what we end up looking for on the surface. Then we go back to the vouchers, and once again, this is trying to get low-income students into private schools. There are usually tensions around that. Once again, some of it because of the cultural capital. It's also trying to assist disabled students, which also disabled students get different kind of help depending on who their parents are. And we all know that because different parents know how to access the system differently. So, all of this is to say that just showing up in the classroom, everyone doesn't get education in the same way. And we haven't even talked about the teachers yet, right? And so when you think about the teachers, once again, I'm going to call this a middle class salary because we're going to have this teacher have a second income or no kids, right? Salary for most public school teachers is about $56,000 a year. And once again, I'm doing that like in a Midwestern area. Now, private school teachers earn less, but once again, cultural capital, what's the benefit? Your kids will probably get like some tuition reimbursement, tuition benefits. Like, so for instance, at McAllister, we can send our kids to the associated colleges of the Midwest for about 80% off. Now, people are like, that's an amazing benefit. Well, one of the reasons why it's an amazing benefit is that I believe in the kind of higher education I'm participating in. I probably couldn't have it for my own kids if we didn't have that, right? And so that's how it works. The same that, you know, if you worked someplace like Mounds Park Academy, you probably would get a cut for your kids going to Mounds Park Academy. Now, what is the classroom environment like? The teaching population has not changed that much since we've had teachers and since we've had desegregation. So I'm not someone that would make an argument for segregated schools. However, when there were segregated schools, you had black teachers. Okay? Now that we have desegregation, 75% of public school teachers are women, 80% of them are white. What that means is like 80% of public school teachers are white women. That used to be a middle class job for black women, particularly in the South. That was a job that was lost after the civil rights movement. Okay, so if we just move forward a little bit, you know, how do people fight some of these fights? Because there are people that are concerned about the teaching profession, don't think it's fair sometimes that teachers are judged on student performance. One of the reasons why people don't think that's fair is because if you've chosen to teach in a low-income school, even if you're not from a low-income family, the students don't perform as well because they don't have as much support at home because the family doesn't have as many resources. And then the teachers say, I have agreed to teach in this school, and now people want to say, I'm not a good teacher. So, you know, it's very challenging. Now, this is the area that I know much better than K through 12 because this is my full-time gig. I spend a lot of time in higher education. As I said, I've been at it for quite a bit of time. Part of what I see is how you can determine who is going to get into higher education. And I don't know if you all realize, but studies show now by the 3rd to 4th grade, you can pretty much see like how a child's going to turn out, which in many ways is unfortunate, right? Because it would seem like, you know, people could kind of stumble a little bit, go through adolescence, go through a certain amount of things, and everything will be all right. But when I think about what the selection process is for higher education, you can pretty much see by the time a kid is 9 years old if they would have an opportunity to study at certain places. Okay. And so that just takes you to the applications. Now, if there's anyone in the room who has been through this with a young person, I applaud you because this will send you over the edge, okay? Because there are scholarship applications that require 8 essays. 8 essays. I don't know if I knew 8 things when I was 17, right? People said I did, but I don't even remember what those 8 things were. And so then there are the SATs, which are all really class-based, right? Class-based in the sense that you really do well if you have preparation. SAT prep class now can be like $1,200. Not only that, I remember, because I grew up in a modest way, the essay questions. I'll never forget the essay question. One of them was about sailing, right? And so it was like the mast of the boat, and then the bow, and I'm trying to picture it all in my head, but I've never been on a boat. Right? I'd never been on a boat. And I mean, I grew up with 2 parents. Like, we actually owned a house. We had a 2-car garage. Like, once again, I thought it was normal. To this day, I'm not even sure if it's middle class. Partly, I feel like if I say it wasn't, it'll offend all of my relatives, right? But I mean, you know, the SAT is for people who understand certain things, right? And even with the scholarship to boarding school, I'd heard of them. That didn't mean I knew what they were. Right? So I remember my first year, someone asking me where I summered. And I was like, oh, she's dumb, because it's not a verb. That's why I won the Black Girl Scholarship, right? Then I was like, oh, wow, here it is a verb, because they have summer homes. And I thought I was awesome because we had one. Right? But that's what it all is. And so all of these questions to determine, right, if you are worthy is really laid out by like what your parents could expose you to as early as the 3rd grade. So, yeah, I just love that. Where do you summer? I was like, but I live here 9 months. Why would I want to go anywhere else but home? And they were like, oh, we'll be in Nantucket. And I was like, I know something that rhymes with that. But I'm being videotaped, so I'm gonna let that go. So, you know, the other thing about class status is that, you know, it's multi-generational. So one thing that has changed with college education now is that there's a big push to get first-generation college students to be on campuses. And that's the other thing. When I was going over the Michigan data, out of those 254 students, a few of them came from households where the parents didn't have education. And so what we're really doing is just replicating education for the educated, unless we go in and intervene and say this opportunity at some point has to open up. People who come from families that aren't educated should have access to higher education. So if we look ahead, there's all kinds of effort for school reform. Something I will take a position on, because often I like to give these talks. I'm like, well, there's this and there's that. Something that I do think that needs to be examined is where billionaires come in, right? And so what is interesting is that people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and other people who are involved in hedge funds are attempting to shape education policy. There are many, many things that I think can be problematic about this. Bill Gates by himself has pledged to spend $1.7 billion strengthening public schools. Now, what I want to know is how his efforts are going to benefit his product, right? Like, I really want to know that. Because one of the things that he'll tell people all the time is like, oh, when we were raising our kids, we wouldn't let them use technology. And I'm like, but my children are glued to it, and you did that. And not only did he do that, did his kids go to public school? I don't know about that, right? And if Zuckerberg is influencing educational policy, does that mean we're gonna have Facebook curriculum? But I mean, that's a very real thing. When Facebook first came about, I would email my students at their McAllister accounts. They wouldn't get back to me. And then I'd get really edgy about it because I was like, I am the professor, you must respond. And then I realized, okay, they're not checking that email account. So for one of my classes, I set up a site on Facebook, and I was like, guess what? The little green light comes on, so I will know that you are ignoring me. So I'm gonna post this question in here and you will respond. Of course, they were all scared by then, so they were like, okay, fine. But I mean, that is a way of showing that Facebook actually can be a platform for education. right? But I'm not saying if that's a good thing or not. And then once I found them on the book, I was like, get off, and respond to my emails at McAllister, because I am the professor. And they were like, whatever, lady. So, but I mean, it's just, you know, all of this, I think, has implications. And so, you know, we've had No Child Left Behind, and, you know, this was to provide more national funding to disadvantaged schools. We know that, you know, with all of this, there's always going to be some, you know, residual fallout in terms of testing standards, what happens when schools have low performance, and then once again, who the teachers are, right? Like, one of the things that you will find in suburban public schools that have more affluence, right? You might have Mrs. So-and-so who becomes an icon because she was there 40 years. Right? Because she's an institution, because she's a part of that community, her kids might have gone there, she believes in that education. When my daughter went to this charter school, it was a revolving door of 23-year-olds who were just like, I'm gonna get teaching experience at this school, and then I'm gonna leave. And it was partly because they didn't make any money, but they also weren't vested. Right? It was a school that they put in a building. It was innovative, educational. I was like, this will be fun. We'll try it. But I mean, it didn't have that grounding that some other schools have, where you just have, you know, the longevity and the legacy. Okay, so the future of how, you know, money operates in these spaces of getting education. The new presidential administration embraces school choice, vouchers, and charter programs as a part of its educational policy. That is fine because people want school choice. Minnesota is a state that has school choice. The thing about it is that if you make enough money, none of that matters to you. None of it. Right? Particularly in a place like in the Midwest, that if you made more than $75,000, we'll use that as our benchmark, you don't need a voucher. What do you need a voucher for? You're probably not going to send your kid to a charter school unless you're like me and be like, that could be interesting. It was also across the street from my job. And, you know, I had her in all these little supplemental programs. It worked out fine, but, you know, these are options for people that don't have other options that also within them have lots of problems, because the public schools are funded unevenly, and then also because private schools do have financial aid, that's an option for people who can't even afford them. So I'm gonna wrap up with that. How are we doing in time? Ooh. Okay, we're doing really well. So we have about 10 minutes just for us to have a dialogue. I will admit, you know, if I don't know, I'll just say, I don't know. And, you know, maybe there'll be someone else in the room, who knows? So let's just see, what are you all thinking?
But do let me bring in so that
Yes.
you can think online,
Well,
or, you know,
please
loud.
let Judy have the mic. Please let her move the mic.
If I understood you correctly, you said that after desegregation, black women who had been in the teaching profession lost their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? I've always thought that it was around that same time that so many opportunities opened for women in general.
Right.
So that black women
Yeah.
no longer needed to think only about teaching as a profession.
Right. Oh, I love that question.
Is there another explanation?
Yes, there is. There is. I love that question. So, for instance, my parents were born in the 1930s. They went to segregated schools. They had all black teachers. By the time there were 4 kids, so the oldest kids started off quasi-segregated. I was one of the younger kids. We started off completely integrated. Once black schools shut down, because then, you know, the city wouldn't have to fund them, and then also busing sometimes happened, right? So what you're doing is taking black kids and dispersing them and busing them to these freestanding white schools. Those schools didn't hire black teachers. So when the black schools closed, there was no place to work. Does that make sense? So I started kindergarten in 1974 in a suburb of Boston. So if you all know anything about forced busing in Boston, which was like really contested and really, really hostile and really difficult, it just so happened that I lived in a suburb just out of Boston, and we were one of 6 black families in the whole town. And so I was the black kid in the first grade that wasn't bussed in. But I never had a black teacher in elementary school. And my parents never had a white teacher. So that's a very different thing. And anybody who could have been a teacher, there was this gap where that wasn't happening. Then the mainstream schools ended up getting a little more open-minded. And then black women could return to teaching, but to this day, it's less than 2% of black men who are in public education.
Here's a question.
I wonder if you could speak about voucher systems more, in particular, any history of it, any places it's been tried, and I'm thinking in particular of Chile, where they, I believe, implemented it as a national policy.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. I'm not even going to try to talk about Chile. The way that I can localize this is that there were families in North Minneapolis that didn't feel like the public schools in North Minneapolis were anywhere near as good as schools, say, in Edina, who were able to get vouchers and then send their kids to the Edina schools. To me, what's fascinating about all this is how policies can seem like a good idea theoretically. If you know about the cultural spaces of North Minneapolis and Edina, those kids might not actually get along that well. And so that was the fallout for some of it, which was you have kids that have gone from birth to 14 that have been around people like them, and now they aren't. And the adults now will admit, because that started in the 90s, the adults now will admit they didn't think it through enough. Like they didn't have anyone on site who was like, here's a way to manage that. It just happened, and then originally it wasn't really a good look.
Here's a question.
Hi, this is so on target to what's going on as I prepare for our 50th reunion at Carleton. I have...
That's how I recognize you.
Yes,
Hi.
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
I knew I recognized you.
Yeah, because my senior year roommate, who became a very accomplished New York attorney, is now gotten a hold of information from the Princeton study about the fact that elite colleges consider their low-income admissions to be 60,000.
Yeah.
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 And she points to her experience of coming from a very, messed up family that didn't have any money, and she would never have gotten into Carleton today. And so she's trying to figure out how, and when she gets interested in some kind of thing, because she advocates for change, how to change admissions, at the colleges, because these ones that are coming with low income are people of color under special programs. And so she's gotten a big pushback. Trying to get this as a discussion item for the board of directors or trustees and the faculty. So I don't know, because it's a lot of schools that are facing this.
I'm really glad you bring that up, just the way that you just said 60 grand. Because like I said, with the data I found with Michigan, 55 grand, you almost don't see students from that background. And I'm sure if you're in a family that makes $60,000 a year, you probably don't consider yourself low income. You might even say you're middle class, right? And so that is really the problem. What I see on our campus, and I'll say that we're really trying to work on this, partly because we didn't get it so right in the 70s. We had this big affirmative action thing in the 70s that no one could forecast how it might turn out. Now we're trying to set up the components of what do you do with the culture? What do you do with the cultural piece? So what if you're smart enough to get in, you can do the work, you show up, your roommate's eating hummus, and you're like, why would you mask chickpea? right? That's a real thing. People have dropped out over less, right? Because they're just traumatized by all these little codes that they don't recognize and they don't understand, and then they feel bad about themselves, right? Whereas if you come from a different class background, you could just say, I don't like hummus, and like walk out, and it's no big deal, which is different from saying, I've never heard of it, and I feel bad that I haven't.
Yeah, Professor, I'm one of those people here, like others, that went to the U of M for less than $1,000 a year. To make it even more interesting, I work part-time, like many other people did too. So I guess the basic question is, can you pinpoint where college costs just went off the rails?
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah,
And also,
that's good.
also
That's a
too,
good question.
I've been told that two of the reasons are explosive administrative costs all over the country, plus grant money went away. So everybody has to take out loans now. So what's going on?
You know, that's all of that. What I know is a big shift happened in the 80s. And one of the things that happened in the 80s was people realized how in higher education there were some flagship public institutions that were fantastic, such as like, say, the University of California system. And they had been just like the University of Minnesota, like under $1,000 a year. When they started realizing what they had, they started creeping the prices up. And one of the reasons why Michigan is such like a hot spot, right, is because then people say, we have to hold on to these spots. That's why you had the big affirmative action case, the Bollinger case, which was, that case is like maybe not even 10 years old yet, where people were like, oh, are people getting in because of affirmative action? If you know anything about affirmative action, you would know that the people of color that end up in these programs have had a head start. People like me, right? Like, you cannot get into certain schools having gone to certain high schools, like, period, dot. I know there are places that McAllister doesn't even recruit, right? And so, and not only that, how many spots are there? And so when people start realizing that some of these public institutions, you know, could provide so much, the prices just went up and up and up, partly because people are willing to pay. People are just willing to pay because they know what will happen if you have a degree from Berkeley. They know what your life, and Judy's like, I went to Berkeley, right? But I mean, it's you know, people are willing to pay for University of Virginia, you know, Berkeley, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Michigan, Minnesota. People are willing to pay. And so it's like any kind of price point and any kind of product. And unfortunately, education has become a product that you just put it out there. It's like the iPhone. I'd like to get one for $37. Right? Unfortunately, like, they're around $900. Somehow, no matter what you make, everybody finds that $900. Somehow, if you want to go to the University of Minnesota, you find it, even if it's loans. And then even though the loan structure has changed, people will borrow it, and then they'll have 2 or 3 part-time jobs and not even know how to pay the money back.
Got a question. And yes, I see people over there.
When my kids were in school, you had to live in the school district that your kids went to school. What do you think is the impact of changing that, of going to the open enrollment and all the different kinds of models?
I think the impact is that you do get a different kind of diversity. And when I say diversity, I'm not even necessarily talking about people of color, right? You can possibly get a different kind of, you know, ideological, possibly lifestyle kind of diversity. But, you know, open enrollment, Minnesotans, for the most part, love open enrollment. Yeah, Aviva. And I'll repeat it, Judy. Oh, sorry. First over here, then Aviva.
Yeah, I'll bring the mic over.
Okay.
Okay.
One of your last templates talked about our national educational policy. Could you tell us, if you would, some thoughts on how our national policy ought to be changed?
You know, I think that is a great question. I think it all begins with early childhood education. So if we had more equity in early childhood education, then what you see on higher education level wouldn't look the way that it looked. And so you wouldn't see only 254 students coming from families that had income of $55,000 or less. You could see students from different class backgrounds. Then it will be just more academic achievement. So what we have now is just people that just benefit from like tutors, to be honest with you, and summer programs. That's the other thing. And so I know people who make the decision, and I'll talk about my family. It's like, so if you send your child to a strong public school, can you send your kid to a place like Exeter for the summer? So the thing about it is, if you haven't paid any tuition all year, if you can find 10 grand for the summer, and it gives your kids 6 weeks where they're not going to be playing Fortnite all the time, then, right, which not that I can relate to that, then when they're applying to college, they'll say like, oh, okay, they didn't like go to Exeter, but they went to the Exeter program. And you can do a program like that summers after 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. So then you submit your application. I've seen college applications. It's like, I spent 3 summers at Exeter. Well, that cost you $30,000 as opposed to $180,000. And so this whole thing about evening the playing field, most people don't have access to that.
Thank you. I had a question also related to the public policy aspects of access to education, because I was one of those people who graduated from college 50 years ago, and it made no difference for me whether I went to an expensive private college or a public university, because I could get a very low interest federal loan and pay it back very easily.
Right.
And now those don't seem to exist. So it's a combination. The public colleges don't have the funding from the federal and state governments they used to have, and the private colleges don't have the same, or the students don't have the same access to public funds to supplement the loan program.
Yeah, now see, the thing about it is anybody can get a low interest loan, right? It's like when teenagers go to the mall and people try to like approach them and get a credit card. Anybody can get a low interest student loan. The difference is you would finish college with $5,000 worth of debt. Now you finish college with $100,000 worth of debt. If you finish college with $100,000 worth of debt and you want to be one of these public school teachers and you're going to make $56,000 a year, what is your life going to look like? That's what the difference is. I've never heard in my life anyone like, oh, I applied to get a student loan, couldn't get it. Are you kidding me? Right? I mean, people walk up to you and be like, you want a student loan? Right? The problem is, it's like how big they are.
Oh, so I just had a question. I know Minnesota I'm a participant in early childhood and family education. It's one of the few states that offers that. But just wondering how that access maybe can help with some of the disparities that you've spoken about.
That's a huge help. That's a huge help. The problem is that if they are part of the day, how do you transport the child from the early childhood place to, say, a daycare if the parent's working? Also, sometimes you have like a disconnect with understanding of how helpful they are, right? And so if you come from a community that believes in keeping the child at home, sometimes you think that, it's a stigma. So I remember having to explain to someone that like Head Start was called that for a reason. It's gonna give you a head start. It was like, but shouldn't we just keep the child at home? And it's like, not necessarily. So some of that's culture.
I think we kind of mentioned, but skipped over a bit, the fact that in the college situation, states have disinvested in education, and the percentage of their funding that comes from tuition has dramatically changed. And the idea that we're all in this together, that motivated people to fund higher education, seems to be gone. I think that's a big factor.
I mean, that's a huge factor. Like what our investment in this has shifted.
I wonder if you have any suggestions or remedies to increase the number of teachers of color in the public schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is such an important endeavor. One thing that I believe in is loan forgiveness, right? So they have programs about, public law. So if you are willing to be a public defender, if you stay in that position for 10 years, they will get rid of a tremendous amount of your student loan debt. I think that sometimes people of color need some kind of incentive to figure out what to do if they're talented enough to be a teacher to only make $56,000 a year, and then they might have $100,000 worth of debt. And because we talked about this intergenerational thing, the older people in their families might be like, we were counting on you to help us. Like, there's no cushion. There isn't even any like moving home. Right? So one of the ways that I became a college professor is that it was a new program at the time, it's like about 30 years old now, is that they said if we went to grad school, they would relieve a certain amount of our debt. Because they were like, if you're smart enough to get a PhD, you probably could just go into banking. Right? And I definitely had relatives who were like, she didn't go into banking? And so, you know, that did help me because, I mean, I was only 21 years old making that decision, say, okay, you know, this could have a long-term benefit.
I wanted to comment on the gentleman's comment here about the disinvestment. I spent my career in higher ed policy. Worked for the Minnesota State University System, and when I began my career, the stated, and it's still in statute, I believe, the stated goal of the state was that they would pay for 2/3 of your education, and the student was responsible for 1/3.
Yep.
It is now more than reversed.
Yep.
I believe the state support is something like 25%. So, I mean, I don't know that that's true in all states, but when you look at education here in Minnesota, not that the things that you said are not also great situation, but the disinvestment of the state. And furthermore, though, for people that wanted to go to technical colleges, they were free.
Oh,
they were free until about 1990.
Sure. But see, that goes back to like this man's question back here. It's like, you know, what happened? This disinvestment with the public schools, that did start sometime around the 80s, and I identify the 80s partly because we were flush. Right? We were in an economic boom, and then this whole 2/3, 1/3 thing, it was like, well, people can afford it, and what we have is valuable. Let's see if they'll pay. People did. And then it flipped.
Hi. Do you have any comments on the policies advanced by Betsy DeVos?
Oh, wow. It is my understanding that her children were not educated in public schools. And with that, I will take our next question from my dear friend Aviva Breen. How was that? Thank you.
Well, I was thinking about this question because when I grew up I also went on the bus and paid, I don't remember what it was, and worked part-time to go to college, so that was another thing. But my kids were in the voluntary desegregation. Well, Minneapolis was under a desegregation plan, which they just got out of not very long ago. And so two schools were paired, and then they were bused to both of them, really, unless they lived close enough to the other one. And that went through junior high. I don't think it applied in high school. But I don't know what we know about, I don't know what we know about what that did or how that acted, because kids weren't completely out of their environment.
Right.
They were half,
Right.
So, but according to my kids, yeah, but the black kids ate dinner over here and the white kids ate, or lunch over here and the white kids ate, and they never, but they did socialize too, and they have friends remaining now, so I don't
See,
know.
that's why I'm hopeful for where we are now, because the generation that experienced that is now in charge, right? And so the first thing now that generation is saying is, we can't pretend like these people are the same, right? And there is a book called, Why Do All the Black Kids Eat Lunch Together? Right? It's because they understand each other. And so now that we have some grown-ups that could predict that, now things are starting to happen so that people can come together and learn from each other. And we haven't been good at that as like older people. For us to ask 15-year-olds to go through everything they're going through and then reach across the aisle and know someone else, it's too much. Like, I can't get my kids out of bed in the morning. It's too much. I hope they watch this.
Can you say something about why we have disinvested both in college education and in some ways in public education, or why in public K-12 or E-12 education, the costs there per student have skyrocketed as well. Maybe not as bad as college, but they've gone up a lot. But why have we disinvested?
I love that question because I went to this seminar and I had the great experience of learning something I didn't expect to learn, which, you know, I'm a big geek, so like that was like huge for me. And someone asked the question, what is the purpose of education? And most of us in the room were like, to learn, right? Just kind of like, why are we talking about this? We're supposed to be smart people. And this, I'll say this guy's name because he's fantastic. I'll send this clip to him. Professor Mark Reinhardt, who's at Williams College, a very elite school in Williamstown, Massachusetts. He said, you went to Williams? All right, purple. He said, the purpose of education is to maintain social class. And then I write these books, partly because of Mark. But really, it hadn't even, I was like, you know, you just go because you're going to like read books and like, you know, get trained in something and maybe you could be an electrician. And Mark was like, let's not be confused. And so you ask why this has happened. This has happened because, as I had that slide, it's like, oh, you get vouchers, or oh, you get charter, or you get, if you are of the ruling class, none of this is a threat to you, right? Madonna's daughter went to Michigan. I think she wrote that check, right? If you have money, you are not worried about early childhood, you're not worried about tutors, you're not worried about nannies, you're not worried about supplemental, you're not worried about summer programs, you're not worried about higher ed, you aren't worried about any of it. I mean, think about it. Donald Trump sent Ivanka to Wharton, right? He wasn't like, you know, maybe she can, you know, and I think he has terrible gender politics, right? But it was his daughter, he was like, she needs to go to Wharton so that she has the training to help me run my business.
Well, this is another question about the University of Minnesota. It was established as a land-grant college, and its mission to be to provide a college education to as many citizens of the state as possible. And it seems in the past several decades that it is moving more and more to trying to be an elitist college with a lot of nationally renowned scholars and a huge money-making grant funding research departments.
Yeah, because
is that a trend or?
Of course, I mean, of course it's a trend because let's just take the sciences, right? The fanciest scientist is going to get the NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant, you know? So if you can recruit the best of the best, then that money's going to come to your institution. Now, the best of the best is going to want to get paid being the best of the best. And so that's another way in which these things have shifted, is how the faculty are paid. There wasn't a thing called like the STAR system in higher education with faculty until like the early 90s. Then we created this thing where there were just people that like taught their classes, graded their papers. Like it used to just be like everyone was like that. Then we created STARs, right? And that's not just in the sciences. I remember one of the reasons why I wanted to be a professor is that I was inspired by the stars, right? And you had, you know, people that taught their faculty at Duke in African American studies that make $250,000 a year. They're stars, and it's Duke. And Duke's endowment is in the billions, the double billions, right? Like Grinnell's like 1.3 billion. But Duke is a double billion endowed school. And so you can pay African American studies professors $200,000 a year.
I think I would like to ask a question. I'd like to go back to the definition of class. Throughout this talk, we have assumed that class and money are synonymous. I have a son who is now working in London, and he tells me that as soon as a person opens his mouth, if he's British, you know right away, within one sentence, what class that person belongs to from his accent. Do we have any other criteria in the United States for class than money?
I mean, definitely. I think that it's ways of being, right? Ways of understanding. And so like the example that I gave is that there are people that could afford a summer session at Exeter for their child, might not have heard of it and understood it. Like I can be in conversation with someone and in minutes I can like discern what their cultural capital is. And so it's not an accent, it's not what you're wearing, it's a certain knowledge base. That's my thought. I mean, I'd love to hear what other people think.
And this is something that's of interest to me. And is there any way of tracking cultural capital? Because one of the reasons that this discussion is so hard to have is that there's a blend between what class means. Class and classy goes back to the days of the hierarchy when upper class was sort of what you aspired to wherever you were. And I don't know how it is now, and it gets messed up with the popular culture. But is there any way to track cultural class?
I mean, sure. I think you can see it in public spaces, right? And part of that also has to do with if you know what you're looking at, right? And so, I mean, I think that I feel like I have ways of tracking. Like if I'm people watching, if I'm in the airport, I feel like I can pick up on certain social cues. But part of it is if you go to these spaces, right? So, I mean, if you, once again, go back to probably only 28% of white Americans have a 4-year degree. That's tracking it right there, right? But then when you delve deeper into that, it's like what kind of professions they go into. Like I said, it's easy to spot and find if you're looking for it.
Hello. I appreciate this lecture. It's been very knowledgeable. I just have a question. Having just gone through the education system and now being in debt.
I saw your sweatshirt. Did you go to
University of Northern Iowa.
Okay.
I'm in debt much less than many other students in other states, luckily. But something that I've been concerned about is the governing over, especially state universities, and the student body not being able to impact the choices of universities.
Sure.
And I was just wondering, especially with the issues that we're seeing with youth not being involved in government, the youth turnout in local elections being quite awful. Do you have any, I guess, suggestions, ways that youth could impact the governing of universities?
I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think that universities have become more hierarchical, and I think that there are some universities, I will not name them, that I don't think are particularly invested, particularly undergrads, right? But even at some research universities, grad students, I don't know if they want student input. I mean, I'm being honest about that. I remember being an undergrad, and I was very involved in student government, and realizing that the big policy decisions were made in the summer. That's real, though. And then someone over here also talked about the expenses that go into administration. One thing I've noticed that when I joined the faculty at Macalester, we had a president and a provost. It was done. Like, those are the people who were in charge, and then everybody else, we had rankings within the faculty, but like, that was the administration, like on the faculty side. I'm not talking about like student affairs, right? Now, we have added, let me count, because I wasn't thinking I was gonna get this question. We've added 5 deans to that. So the chain of command is real. So for a student to get something done, you're going to take it to maybe a junior faculty member because they're closer to your age, they're kind of cool, like they'll talk to you about stuff. Then the junior person will take it to a senior faculty member who will take it to an associate dean, who will take it to the dean, who will then take it to the provost. And then by the time it gets to the provost might be like, wow, this is like my 8th request today, right? Which it didn't always work like that.
Okay, I see a hand.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm thinking about my son. My son, who's close to 40, went to University of Minnesota Duluth, and like you said, tuition wasn't too bad, and he came from a pretty.
Are you guys middle class? It's just a joke. It's just a joke.
Kind of a middle class background. Yeah. But he's in a position right now where his kids are going to a private school, and they have a tutor for some stuff. And,
Sure.
you know, I mean, it's interesting to watch. And it's like, well, you know, people who have more money will always do those things. So doesn't it come down to the whole question of distribution of wealth?
Completely.
And unless we change our attitudes to, unless the wealthy decide they want to share more resources, then you know, you can argue about all the details, but it doesn't really change.
I mean,
anything.
it really is about distribution of wealth and also how public schools have changed. So we have some generational differences, right? So you might have some grandparents that might say, you know, I went to public schools, it was good enough for me, why shouldn't it be good enough for them? I don't know anyone over 60 that went to a school that had police officers on site or metal detectors. I mean, if there's anyone in the room that can say that, like, you know, I was in high school, you know, in the 1950s and we had metal detectors, I'll be like, okay, tell me about it, right? That's a big difference. And so what happens is, if you know, maybe you don't want your kid to go to Harvard, but if you know that if you want your kid to go to Harvard, they're only going to get in having gone to 7 high schools, what are you going to do? Just send them to, like, the family alma mater, which now might have shifted?
I think we have time for just about one more question here, so.
Thanks. I'll make a comment if that's okay.
Sure.
You talked about the reason for education or the motivation. I think historically, you know, thinking of America, to read the Bible was a very important motivation in the earliest. When free public education really took off was when immigration became such a phenomenon that people worried about knitting the country together.
Right.
And so that's what free public education was supposed to do. And I have this feeling that nowadays people don't think they need it for anything. They think that the country is just cruising along and everything is going to be all right, even if it goes to hell.
And, you know, I love that comment because a couple things. So when you talk about worry about public education because of who might be sitting there, that is what happened in the South, as I mentioned early. The minute desegregation showed up, people said, we'll set up private schools, and then tuition was for $1, right? But it was to make sure you didn't have that intermingling. Then when you talk about people not being worried about education, part of it is because professions have changed. Right? And so I know when I was growing up, the only answer to making a certain amount of money was through education. Now my 12-year-old announced recently that he was going to be a YouTuber. And I was like, what is that? Right? Pretending like that's going to happen, it is not. But I mean, how you would even become a YouTuber, I don't know if that has anything to do with college. And he doesn't seem to care. Right? But I mean, I bring that up to say that people twice his age, like there are 24-year-olds out there, they're just like, I have the talent to develop an app. And why do I want loan debt? And so, and you don't have to go to technical college, which used to be free and now they can be expensive. You know, if you have certain tech skills, you don't need that education either. And so I think that's partly what you're noticing, that when I was coming along, what were your options? Right? You had to go to schooling for something, right? Now people are like, you know, where did Zuckerberg go to school, right? And so that ends up being the litmus test for some people.
Can you take one more question?
I'll take one more.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to make a quick comment. In 1917, a school was started called Dunwoody Institute in downtown Minneapolis. And it was founded and it was supported by the business interests of Minneapolis. We're talking about the milling industry and the lumber industry. And the reason for Dunwoody Institute was to channel those immigrant kids who weren't expected to go to college. But the main reason to put them through Dunwoody was to keep out the unions. And in that case, it was very successful because those kids, once they graduated, they were put into what was called an open shop. And that was called, nowadays it's called social engineering, and it has a long history in this community.
Sure, I appreciate that because I did not realize that. But it helps us understand partly why we are where we are. And I think this is when Judy tells me I need to walk away.
Oh, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Next week, race and gender and sports,
Yes,
right?
and then week 3, I'm going to talk about my new book on the Me Too movement.